watching CBS News' continuing coverage of the war in the Gulf. From Saudi Arabia, here is Dan Rather.
From the U.S. and Allied side, from its point of view, so far so good in the launching of the ground war offensive, but it's still in the early stages. Here are the headlines of the hour. Operation Desert Storm enters what President Bush has called its final phase with the battle on the ground. The Pentagon puts the lid on all information from the front from the American side. The British, French, and Arab sources are still talking. The U.S. charges Iraq with last-minute atrocities inside Kuwait. After more than 5 weeks of a fierce war in the air, the ground war has finally begun. Arab and British sources say now that the Allied forces are as far as 18 miles inside Kuwait. They have attacked on at least 2 other fronts, and possibly an amphibious assault is underway. There are also British reports of an Allied incursion into southern Iraq. That's the one that General Chris and Bob Schieffer were talking about a moment ago, which is expected to be the main attack. There is almost no information available from the U.S. military. Understandably, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney says that the Pentagon is going to be silent.
When it is safe to begin discussing the operation, we will do so in as much detail as we prudently can. But for now, our regular briefing schedule here at the Pentagon and in Riyadh is suspended until further notice.
As the battle was about to begin, U.S. military spokesmen at the Pentagon and here in Saudi Arabia accused Saddam Hussein of a last-minute reign of terror. They said that thousands of Kuwaitis were being rounded up, tortured, and executed, and a Kuwaiti spokesman on this broadcast a short while ago confirmed that that was happening, saying that there wasn't any doubt about it, it wasn't propaganda, it was a terrible fact of the war. Let's check in with Ron Allen at the Pentagon. Ron?
Good morning, Dan. Here at the Pentagon, things have really quieted down after Secretary Cheney said that there would be a lid. That is an order that was taken very seriously around these corridors. We have been trying to find out what we can about the status of the ground battle, but information has been very difficult to come by. The Secretary in his remarks made it clear that there would be no information released that would in any way compromise the mission.
This phase of the combined air, land, and sea campaign has been carefully planned to force Iraq out of Kuwait with a minimum number of casualties to Allied forces. Up to now, we've been as forthcoming as possible about military operations. But from this point forward, we must limit what we say. We've now undertaken a major military operation. Allied military units are on the move. Their positions, movements, and plans must be carefully safeguarded. We must assume that the enemy is confused about what is happening on the battlefield, and it is absolutely essential that we not do anything inadvertently ourselves to clarify the picture for him. Everything we say about the operation from this point forward, every detail we offer, would increase the likelihood that the military forces of Iraq could learn more about our operations. Such information would put military operations at risk, and even the most innocent-sounding information could be used directly against the men and women whose lives are on the line carrying out these operations.
The Secretary made it clear that the attack is designed to confuse the enemy, to make him think that we are coming from directions that we might not, in fact, be coming from. He made it clear that he thought even the simplest of bits of information might in some way help Saddam Hussein. If you'll remember, the first 30-plus days of this, the air operation were designed to eliminate his command and control capability and to give him no idea or no way to see the battlefield. That has always been an advantage that the Allies thought they had, and it is one that they are trying to maximize, particularly now that this very complicated and complex ground attack has begun. Dan, back to you.
Thanks, Ron. Someone is saying, well, General Chris and Bob Schieffer were talking a moment ago about where the main force attack might go and where the other attacks have been. Part of that, most of it, has been talked about by U.S. commanders themselves. Part of it to create confusion in the mind of Saddam Hussein. Yes, we know forces are going to southern Iraq, but where do they go? Where are they headed? Are they going all the way to the Euphrates River? Are they engaged in an envelopment tactic or an encirclement tactic? Are they going to use the so-called vertical envelopment, which includes airborne assault, helicopter airborne assault, parachute assault? All of these options are available to Norman Schwarzkopf, and by throwing them out as options and sketching the rough outline of the battlefield strategy, which Saddam Hussein already knows, it creates confusion in his mind. Let's go now to the White House, and Mark Phillips is covering for us there. Mark?
Dan, there may still be a virtual blackout on the exact details of what is happening in terms of the battle in the Gulf, but we have managed to learn things over the course of the evening here about the parallel political discussions that have gone through the course of today and even extending back into yesterday. This was, of course, in the end, a political decision to go ahead with this attack, and the difficulty has been to keep the political thinking amongst the coalition on pace with what was a pretty cast in stone battle plan. As we discussed a little earlier, General Schwarzkopf had decided that this was the evening that was the optimum time for that battle to ensue. There had been a lot of discussions over the course of today between President Bush and various of the coalition participants, notably Prime Minister Major of Britain, also Chancellor Kohl, also Prime Minister Ozal, also Prime Minister Mulrooney. The one loose screw in this intricate clockwork, if you will, was that of the Soviet Union. There was a long telephone call here initiated by President Gorbachev to President Bush, beseeching him to delay this attack through a period of a day or two because President Gorbachev said the Iraqis were feeling the pressure, that their position had changed and was coming closer and closer to the American demands, and that their position might in fact change even more. That conversation went on for 45 minutes, so clearly even with translation there was a lot of discussion back and forth. During that conversation, President Gorbachev also said that he had talked to Prime Minister Major and to President Mitterrand of France. So this was, in fact, the most delicate period, if you will, of the day politically, trying to keep the whole political front intact, and in the end, it worked. The coalition, including the Soviets at this point, have announced that they are behind, obviously, this attack. Dan.
Thanks, Mark. What will keep the Iraqis fighting? Leadership, if they have it. As we've seen in the early border clashes, units with poor leaders tend to surrender en masse, and particularly those units that are faced with overwhelming firepower. Other Iraqi forces have fought well under what appears to be good leaders. Some would say that the Battle of Khafji was an example of that. It's a mixed bag on the Iraqi side. We do know this, that under what's called this air-land battle concept, the U.S. and some of its allied forces depend mightily on excellent leadership all up and down the line, and local initiative leadership. Now, that's supposed to make the big difference, particularly in an open desert armor, fire, and movement campaign. Combat over the next few days will provide the life and death test. Eric Ingberg's looking at some of the weapons the Allies are relying on to help them with their leadership. Eric?
Dan, one of the reasons that Iraq's army, even after the pummeling they've taken from the Air Force, is still dangerous is because they have plenty of tanks and they have plenty of artillery pieces. The U.S. High Command said before the ground offensive got underway that it believes it has destroyed about 40% of the Iraqi army's tanks, but that still leaves them with about 2,000, enough to pose a real threat to the troops involved in the offensive. Now, to neutralize the kind of armor that Iraq has with minimum casualties to ground troops, the Americans are relying on their control of the skies. And a big part of that is a strange-looking airplane called the A-10. It is so ugly that the pilots call it the Warthog. Already the Warthog has made itself something of a hero to American ground troops. I've seen them salute it as it goes over. They like it so much. It is built for knocking out tanks. It carries almost 8 tons of bombs and other kinds of ordnance, including missiles that it can drop on ground targets. It is built to sustain or to withstand withering ground fire. The pilot actually rides inside a titanium cockpit so that if he is hit by machine gun fire, he can survive. The gun on the Warthog is a Gatling-type gun that fires 30-millimeter rounds. And this airplane, an old-fashioned type airplane, that is to say it doesn't have much in the way of electronics and computers and things like that, is built to be flown. One pilot says it's ugly and mean. It's a pilot's kind of airplane. And when American armored and mechanized infantry are exposed, have their flanks exposed, the way they're going to have in this kind of a headlong dash against Iraqi targets, the kind of control of the skies that the Warthog can provide will be critical, Dan.
There are a lot of Iraqi tanks left in there, particularly with experienced tankers in the Republican Guard. the weapons to get them, the M1 tank weapon, which has longer range, the TOW guided missiles on the ground, the Apache and other helicopters that can attack from very close in, and aircraft such as the Warthog.
Control of the sky is absolutely essential to the Americans' ability to get through this without a lot of casualties.
Thanks, Eric. There are, as we know, many Americans of Arab heritage. How are they reacting to this? Drew Griffin of our CBS affiliate KIRO-TV in Seattle has a report from one mosque.
It is a regular night of prayer at Seattle's Islamic Mosque, but those arriving here say this is no regular night. Tonight, as they kneel to pray, they pray for an end to bloodshed in their sacred homelands.
We feel the pain. No matter who gets killed there, we are human beings.
With their prayers come outrage at President Bush, blaming him for rushing into a ground war, when just this morning Iraq's foreign minister was talking peace, giving them hope.
Nobody have anything to lose when they talk peace. And they really, George Bush himself realized the peace could work out. And that just did not work with his macho image.
The people of the Islamic Mosque of Seattle do not view this war as George Bush versus Saddam Hussein or Iraq versus the United States. This is a war where Muslims will be fighting Muslims, something that tugs at the heart of their Islamic religion.
For all of them, this is a disaster. Nobody is happy with this war. I think innocent people will die.
And so tonight they pray for the innocent people and a quick end to the fighting in the Persian Gulf. At Seattle's Islamic Mosque, Drew Griffin for CBS News.
Sari Nasser of Jordan University in Amman joins us now. Thank you for being with us, Professor. Welcome. As a Palestinian, what's your reaction to the beginning of the ground war?
Well, our reaction is that we're sorry that such a battle had to take place or has to take place now. But you see, I think that as a Palestinian, we wonder that since we have been thrown out, ever since we have been thrown out of Palestine in 1948 and in 1967, we haven't seen the United States come to our help. For such a long time, America did almost nothing to help us return to our land. The United States claims today that it is trying to implement the United Nations resolutions. And there are so many resolutions concerning the problem of Palestine. And there is nothing. America did not do anything. And we are sorry to see America coming into this area to use its armament, its armies, to destroy, to fight. They always tell us, the United States, that we have to arrive at a negotiated settlement with Israel. And yet, they refuse to negotiate with Iraq. And that's how we feel. We feel very, very sorry indeed.
Professor, you know it's the American way to hear opposing points of view, to hear all points of view. Respectfully, may I ask, do you believe that Saddam Hussein invaded, occupied Kuwait to help the Palestinian cause?
Well, I think you see that there is a misconception about Saddam and Iraq and what he did to Kuwait. By the way, as Palestinians, we are against the occupation of Kuwait or any land that does not belong to those occupiers, because we are occupied ourselves. However, I think that you must remember that Saddam Hussein is not the cause of what is happening today in the Middle East. He is a symptom, as Nasser was, Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt was at one time. You see, in 1956, France and Britain attacked Nasser. They attacked him, and it was called then collusion. The United States was not a part of that, and we were very grateful for that. However, 20 years hence or so, we find that the United States is coming in with France and Britain again, under the name of coalition, to fight another leader. Now, I don't think that you are really getting at the cause of what is happening in the Middle East. I think you are chasing shadows. Saddam is a man who will one day die. whether of natural causes or otherwise. There will be other Saddams. The issue at hand is the Palestinian problem. Unless you help to solve this problem, you will never get a stable Middle East, and we will never get peace. We are very, very sorry indeed to hear that the United States is here to fight, because for a long time, the negative predispositions of the Arabs towards the West would be reinforced and would be intensified.
Professor, thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome.
One does not have to agree with your point of view to say that you have a right to say it. We appreciate you being with us. The fighting on the ground goes on. The full extent of it, the scope of it is unclear, but we know that along the border of Saudi Arabia with Kuwait and Iraq, and on the sea very near the Kuwaiti shoreline, that attacks are underway. Earlier tonight, I talked with CBS News reporter Bob McEwen, who was right near the front line. I'm going to replay the tape of that conversation for you.
Well, Dan, it's first light here, and this is one of the areas where oil wells have been burning, so there's a great deal of oily gray in the sky. We are, as you said, located just over a mile from the border between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait in eastern Saudi Arabia. Until yesterday morning, the front line was a quarter mile from our position. We could see it. It was a line of light artillery vehicles. Yesterday at 8 o'clock in the morning, a column of tanks moved in from the west, and something quite unusual happened. Usually the bombardment here in the time we've been here for the past 4 or 5 days has taken place mostly at night. At 9 o'clock yesterday morning, there was bombardment from every direction, from a warship, presumably the Wisconsin or the Missouri out in the Gulf, from artillery and overhead from bombers. And under that cover, the tanks that had arrived from the west moved up along the sand wall, the 12-foot sand wall that's a mile from us along the border, and moved into position. So the front moved up. We, at first light this morning, can't see them. We don't know if they're still there. We don't know if they've moved over the night. But one thing we can tell you is that the bombardment last night, and it continues to this moment, has been exceedingly heavy, heavier than anything we have heard. We were watching it last night. Because of the oil in the sky, we couldn't see the flashes. We could hear the booms. The ground rumbles every time a bomb falls in Kuwait a mile from us, or one of the warships fires its big 16-inch guns. And we could literally hear the shells from the Gulf, from the warship, whichever is the Wisconsin or the Missouri, going overhead. So exceedingly heavy bombardment here that continues to this moment.
Bob McEwen, we believe yours to be the very first report, certainly the first independent report from the battlefront itself. As dawn breaks, what are you seeing and hearing, and have you talked to troops, talked to Marines up there? What's their mood? What's their morale?
We're behind the Allied lines. Most of the troops in this area are Saudi infantry and artillery and armored vehicles run by the Qataris. To be very honest, we haven't approached them because we don't want them to know that we are here. But when certainly last night got the sense that something was happening, before the bombardment began, which was 10 o'clock our time, 2 p.m. Eastern, it was very, very quiet. On previous nights, you could hear voices, you could hear yelling, you could hear people off in the distance. There was none of that last night. It was eerily quiet. Earlier in the day, we had heard the discharge of machine gun fire. We presume it was just the Saudi army testing their equipment. So there was an eerie calm last night, followed by the heaviest bombardment that we've seen up here for 4 or 5 days. Let me just give you a sense of what we have seen in this area, and I don't think there are any military secrets here. This is what everyone knew existed up here. We've driven west along the front line, literally in front of the artillery. And it's the impossibly flat Saudi plain here. It's desert, and it just goes on forever. And as you looked out across it, you saw what appeared to be gopher hills. What they were, as you got closer, were sand walls, and behind each of them would be a light artillery piece, a heavy gun, or a tank. We presume, we didn't venture out there yesterday for fear of being detected, but we presume that a lot of that has moved up towards the border. We saw a lot of movement on the roads yesterday.
Bob, of course, the guns being silent for a period, that's classic when you're going to launch a big offensive. Then the signal is given for the terrific barrage, and so it played itself out just by the book. Bob, is there any indication there as to whether the Iraqis are still in their first line of defense or whether they have moved back to their second line of defense as the Allies begin to bombardment and indeed move across the border?
Well, all we have on that is a few discussions we've had with various individuals in this area. And again, they've had to be couched in the most tactful way. But the original expectation up to a couple of days ago was that the initial Iraqi line, and we are a mile from the border where I'm speaking to you now, the Iraqi line was about 8 kilometers or 5 miles behind that. And it was presumed that from the border back to that Iraqi position 5 miles farther back, there was the classic defensive system that the Iraqis have set up. The minefields, the trenches, perhaps filled with oil to capture tanks, and behind that, the troops who have had, at this point, more than 6 months to dig in. There's no way of knowing that. Frankly, we can see into Kuwait on a night, on a good day, before the oil well started to burn 2 days ago. We could see into Kuwait. We still couldn't detect that, so they're farther back than our line of sight. They're not very far away, and the ground here rumbles. Everything shakes when a bomb hits over there, so we're that close. We have no way of knowing whether they're still at that 5 mile point or whether they've moved even farther back.
As part of our CBS News live coverage of the beginning of the ground war offensive, we're talking to Bob McEwen, CBS News reporter who's 1 mile from the Kuwaiti border. Bob, any indication of how far up you think the Allies are now?
Well, all we know is that when the sun went down yesterday, we could see the tanks along the sand wall a mile from us. Now, these are what they call the berms that they've built all the way along the border. What you would see from my position, if it were that kind of day again, and with the oil in the air is not likely to be today, you see a Saudi border tower. You see the first village across the border in Kuwait, the border crossing, and between that, this 12-foot wall, yesterday lined with, I presume, Saudi and Qatari tanks. I don't know if they're still there, but the bombardment's been ferocious overnight, and I presume that they haven't ventured too far into it. So I presume they are still there, just waiting for this bombardment to take its toll and then to make their move.
And ground to air, that is to air to ground attacks from, have you seen much air attack through that smoke from the burning oil wells?
Well, we hear the planes overhead all the time. And it's just impossible to see anything. It's like an oily tarpaulin hanging over our heads here. But you can certainly hear them. Some of the other sounds you do hear, the spotter plane, which is not very high tech, and which you can distinguish. It sounds almost like a Cessna overhead. And before the warships fire, what you hear is what they call the drone, and it is an automatic 12-foot plane essentially, which goes out and takes surveillance photographs of the Iraqi positions and sends them back to either the Missouri or the Wisconsin, whichever has been firing recently. And that is aptly named.
If I may,
it's called the drone, and it drones. So those are some of the sounds we've been hearing. The spotter planes, the bombers high overhead, the drone coming out from the warships, and this constant rumble beneath our feet. I mean, literally, I am vibrating as I speak to you as the bombs go off a mile or 5 miles or 10 miles into Kuwait.
Bob McEwen. That was a tape of Bob McEwen's first report from the battlefront. It was the first independent report of the evening by any reporter from right on the front line. Baghdad Radio predicts victory in most noble battle. Dateline Nicosia, Cyprus. Baghdad Radio and the first Iraqi comment addressing the Allied ground offensive predicted victory today in what it called the most noble battle in history. Baghdad Radio said, and I quote, "Iraq is not a prize for anyone. It is not going to surrender to threats. Iraq's army has been prepared for Martyrdom's Day, which is unique in the history of wars." The broadcast was monitored in Cyprus. It gave no details about the fighting. It spoke to Iraqi troops, and again I quote, "The whole world is waiting, O heroes, for your great achievement, and follows your brave strikes that you continue to aim at the enemies of God and humanity." And then Baghdad Radio concluded by saying to its troops, "You are waging now the most noble battle and achieving the greatest victories of the army of atheism and aggression, the first of its kind in the history of wars." Baghdad Radio calling the U.S. and Allied armies an army of atheism and aggression. Dr. Bob Arnott is here with us again now. What about evacuating the inevitable casualties? We hope there'll be few, but there are bound to be some.
Yeah, one of the biggest problems as they've looked at this system is backing up casualties. So military medical experts said, how can we prevent this from happening? Now, there's a facility called Medbase America that may see the majority of the Army casualties. At the front end of this, they have clearing platoons to get people in and seen as quickly as they can. At the back end, they have this staging facility, which is unique. This is right on a runway tarmac. These people are about to be evacuated out of theater. Every man they can evacuate means another bed that's free. Some of them have spinal injuries, broken legs, self-inflicted bullet wounds of one kind or another. Now, this is called a tactical evacuation. This is a C-130 Hercules. They are evacuated within the theater. The other kind of evacuation is strategic, meaning that they take them out of this theater, say, to Germany. Now, these people may have bones that are not yet set. They may have surgery that still needs to be performed, but they are stable enough to be able to put them on this transport. And look at this picture. See how crowded it is in there. They have them stacked 4 or 5 high. I talked to one of the physicians who said that these flights can be just wild. Someone's blood pressure is dropping, someone else has an irregular heart rate. So they need to treat that. And of course, they're very proficient. They're real experts at being able to treat this in the air. And it's a big part of this medical system, being able to evacuate these patients to make room for more critically injured patients.
Dr. Bob Arnott. Thanks. Emphasizing, as General Schwarzkopf has right through, that one of the goals of the Allied ground offensive is to keep casualties to a minimum. No one can expect to eliminate them, but one reason that General Schwarzkopf's plan is so bold and entails so many risks is that part of his orders were to keep casualties as low as possible. One key to how quickly the Allied forces can move and how effective they will be is how effective the M1A1 tank is going to perform. This is the key to General Schwarzkopf's strategy. We know the M1A1 can outlast the Soviet-made T-55s, T-62s, and T-72s, but can it get to the enemy in good shape? Experts tell us that if the crews do 3 simple procedures on the way north, they should be just fine. Simple. Check the oil filters, check the fuel filters, check the suspension system fluids. Simple maintenance to keep a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment running, gunning, and winning, the M1A1 tank. Now, here are the headlines on the war at this hour. The ground war is on, what President Bush calls the final phase of the liberation of Kuwait. U.S. and Allied forces are said to be advancing rapidly northward into Kuwait and Iraq. In one early victory, it's reported an island commanding the approach to Kuwait City was taken. Hundreds of Iraqi troops were captured there by U.S. Marines. President Bush says that he has ordered the military to use, and I quote now, all forces available to what he calls eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait. British and Arab reports, one by the British News Service, say the Allies are attacking on at least 4 fronts, including amphibious assaults on the coast of Kuwait, and that they are conducting a variety of diversions to keep the Iraqis off balance. That was part of the plan, was to keep these surprises going. Inside Kuwait, the troops head into a hellish scene, burning oil rigs, spanning the horizon, pumping dense black smoke into the sky and confusing the battleground. U.S. commanders have designed their ground offensive for a quick strike in hopes of getting a quick victory, but they warn it will not be easy. Our CBS News coverage will continue. We'll pick up in the morning. Dan Rather for CBS
News. Stay with CBS News for continuing coverage of the war in the Gulf. This is CBS.
The new Tide is Ultra Tide.
You're using much less detergent.
Ultra small, ultra intensified.
But, I mean, is it going to do the job? Look at this dirt. It goes all the way through to the seams.
For cleaning deep down inside, new Tide is ultra powerful. One little scoop cleans down to the fiber itself.
It cleaned right down to the core of the corduroy.
The new Tide is Ultra Tide.
I couldn't be happier.
It's the last chance winter clearance at L.A. Joe. We're blowing out winter